wrestlers are, in a way, scary. Trust me, I've been around the business. They're all total monsters. Some are able to instill fear more so than others. This is especially true when we're gullible little brats who believe that not only could a Hollywood actor become world champion, but that a man has the ability to conjure lightning or can make himself disappear at will. Wrestling is inherently silly, of course, and such wrestlers typically don't pass muster once you get to big boy school. But when you're an annoying little tyke, anything seems possible, and ever the capitalists, wrestling organizations deploy such horrifying inventions as a means of scaring us into the arena. Or maybe they're just sadistic, who knows? WWE are chief among them, of course, and while there have been many petrifying performers over the years in other companies across the globe, Bruiser Brody, Abdullah the Butcher, Ox Baker, and so on, we grew up on Vince McMahon's product, and so it's his creations that continue to haunt us. And yes, while there have been many wrestlers who are effective when it comes to racking on fans' nerves, this list will look at who had us keeping the light on at night when we were young. To be young again. So basically from the late 80s to the late 90s. So sit back, take a deep breath, check under your bed, and join me, Adam Pacitti from Cultaholic.com, because these are 10 WWE stars who frightened us as kids. Join us. Number 10, Jake the Snake Roberts. Jake Roberts was such an effective heel and had a menacing presence on our television screens because, rather than being the traditional ranting and raving madman, he was cold and calculated and really drew you in before doing something that could chill you to your core. Speaking in a hushed whisper, Jake was scary because he had such conviction in his evil beliefs. He could explain why he had to DDT Ricky Steamboat on the concrete floor or why he had to torment the Ultimate Warrior, and you believed in him because he believed in himself. And he had a massive snake, which he brought to the ring in a bag. That had something to do with it too. Whether it was a python, cobra, or boa constrictor he was bringing down the aisle, Jake played into people's natural ophidiophobia, which is a fear of snakes before you go rushing off to Wikipedia. Since folks typically don't like the serpents and damn sure wouldn't want to encounter one, Jake could use the snakes as a way to psychologically get into the heads of his opponents and those who were watching in the crowd or at home. For those of us who saw it at an impressionable age, we will never rid ourselves of the image of one of the little bastards chewing on Macho Man Randy Savage's arm like it was a Slim Jim. Number 9, Mankind. Mick Foley was scaring people long before he came to WWE, turning heads and stomachs the world over as the masochistic Cactus Jack. His penchant for pain and suffering certainly made people question his sanity, but it was his move to WWE and transition into Mankind that really made people wonder whether he was all there. His willingness to inflict damage on himself or others, usually himself, was still present, but the new character had a chilling backstory that was told very effectively through vignettes and promos. Really, what kid wouldn't be a tad wary of a mask-wearing, boiler room-dwelling, schizophrenic nutter who spoke to a rat and squealed like a pig? It was a very chilling presentation and Foley played it brilliantly, amplifying everything to the point where he became a main eventer within months of his arrival. A 1997 sit-down interview with JR, which ended with Mankind attacking the announcer in frenzied fashion, cemented him as WWE's premier psychopath. Part of Foley's genius was his ability to take all of Mankind's undesirable traits and use them to generate sympathy, as he evolved from one of WWE's most feared forces into one of the most sympathetic and relatable good guys ever. The latter iteration of Mankind is the most fondly remembered, but the version that first showed up on our screens is the one who gave us the willies. Number 8, Doink the Clown. Another gimmick that tapped into a common fear was Doink the Clown, who was much closer to something dark and disturbing like Pennywise than he was Ronald McDonald when he first burst onto the scene at the end of 1992. Though there have been many Doinks over the years, the terrifying clown was most effectively portrayed by Matt Bourne, a troubled soul who seemed to have no problem going to evil places. Rather than receive the typical vignette treatment of the time, Doink would simply show up in the crowd, sitting next to unsuspecting fans who did well to avoid having a small heart attack once they had sussed they were in close proximity to the sinister jester. As well as being just generally creepy, Doink would play mind games with his opponent, as well as playing tricks on the fans fans, and was actually one of WWE's more strongly pushed acts of the time. While naturally intimidating for kids during the cartoon era, any adult with a slight case of coulrophobia, that's fear of clowns to a simpleton like you, bozo, would have been reaching for the remote or hiding behind the sofa whenever he was on television. When Bourne was fired, the Doink character inevitably morphed into something much more child-friendly, and then came the little people. Number 7, Nailz. Look, I'm not too afraid of snakes and I really don't mind clowns, but the one thing I've always been terrified of is big, nasty criminal men. There are no snakes in Newcastle, besides Jack the Jobber, and I'd only be upset at a clown if he pied me in the face, but criminals are a very, very real threat. So, when Nailz showed up in WWE in 1992, I did what every logical person would do. I called the police. Thankfully, WWE had their own member of the force on the roster, as the big boss man was on hand to sort him out. In the storyline, the big man from Cobb County, Georgia was the ex-con's former corrections officer, with Nailz claiming that he was on the receiving end of some rather unfair treatment while serving time behind bars. Fueled by an insatiable need for revenge, Nailz feuded with Bossman for much of the year and terrified kids with his size, scowl, cartoon villain voice, and overall aggressive demeanor. A rough, no-nonsense brawler inside the ring, there were big plans for Nailz with potential feuds against Ultimate Warrior, Bret Hart, and The Undertaker on the horizon. The man playing the character almost got sent to the slammer for real, however, when he shoot-attacked Vince McMahon during a heated backstage incident. Number 6, Andre the Giant. The eighth wonder of the world stood tall in a world filled with giants. He was the biggest of the big, and rather than just being simply tall and wide, he was a star who had an amazing aura about him. Wherever he went, people couldn't help but stare, or run and hide. While Andre did play the beloved babyface and endeared himself to millions of children with his appearance in The Princess Bride, the fact is that he was a naturally scary sight, especially to those shy of 3 feet tall. I mean, who didn't fear for Hulk Hogan's life when Andre challenged him to a match at WrestleMania, ripping the shirt from his body with a simple flick of the wrist? Luckily, the Hulkster was able to overcome that challenge by slamming the 800-pound giant in front of 150,000 fans in the Silverdome, brother! But the fact is that Andre was a force to be reckoned with, regardless of who he was facing. Though Andre wouldn't harm a fly in real life and was actually upset that children were so frightened of him, he did police a locker room full of wrestlers who walked on eggshells in fear of getting on his bad side. Nicknamed the Boss, Andre kept the boys in the back as nervous as he would any 7-year-old child. Number 5, Papa Shango. These days, you'll see Papa Shango crop up whenever anyone talks about naff gimmicks of the past, but let me tell you something. Those same people mocking the character's theatrical presentation were probably crying into their bowl of Cheerios while watching him on WWE Superstars back in 1992. Yes, it's retrospectively a little bit hokey, but Papa Shango was someone who had an uncanny ability to instill fear in the hearts and minds of the impressionable. He was some sort of voodoo witch doctor, a mountain of a man with a painted face who carried a smoking skull to the ring and twitched and chanted in ominous gibberish under his breath. Once in the ring, his offense was unexceptional, but you don't need fancy holds and high-impact moves when you can set your opponent's shoes on fire or make them bleed black goo. Shango would put curses and spells on his opponents to bring about the otherworldly acts, a horror movie boogeyman come to life. He wasn't around for too long, about 1.5 years all told, but he made his mark, particularly during his feud with the Ultimate Warrior. Was it a good feud? No, not really. Did a lot of this stuff look a bit shoddy even back then? Yeah, a fair few eyes rolled. But was Papa Shango absolutely terrifying to the boys and girls who made up WWE's core audience? Believe me when I tell you, ooga booga wooga, yes, he was. Number 4, Waylon Mercy. Like Nailz, Waylon Mercy was frightening because he was a believable creation. The outwardly peaceful southern gentleman was inspired by one of the silver screen's great lunatics, with the look and mannerisms patterned after Robert De Niro's portrayal of Max Cady in Cape Fear. Waylon was introduced through a series of vignettes where he would be doing something ostensibly innocent, like talking about hosting a picnic, but the tone would eventually turn dark dark, and Mercy would sign off by telling the camera that lives were going to be in his hands. The implication being, of course, that he either could or was going to kill someone. And the act continued in his matches as Mercy would behave with perfect decorum and manners on his way to the ring, shaking hands with fans and thanking them for coming to see him wrestle, but when the bell would ring, he would transform and become ultra aggressive, typically ending bouts by choking his opponents out, while his eyes grew bigger than Shawn Michaels' ego. Once he'd invariably smashed through an opponent and the bell would ring to signal the end of the match, Mercy went back to playing nice. Again, the gimmick didn't last too long, mostly due to Dan Spivey's knackered knees, but it was suitably scary while it lasted. Number 3, Kamala. Kamala bounced in and out of WWE throughout the years, and every time he showed up would make an impression. In my underwear, as I pooped myself. Okay, so I didn't really do an oopsie in my undies whenever the Ugandan giant appeared, I swear down, but he was a very frightening presence. He was big and wild and wore paint and came to the ring wearing a giant wooden mask and needed a handler and would slap around even the big boys like Hogan and Andre whenever he stepped between the ropes. Fans genuinely believed that the man who was hailed as being from deepest, darkest Africa and carried a spear and shield to the ring was uncontrollable and could do serious damage to both them and his opponents. Though perhaps culturally insensitive, the gimmick worked and was so well received because the man portraying it, the late James Harris, was committed to the role and could convince you that he was a savage plucked from a far-off land and brought to WWE. In real life, Harris was a gentle soul with a heart of gold that was beloved by all, and he was able to channel those qualities when he eventually became a babyface. Number 2, Kane. Glenn Jacobs had tried to scare us into brushing our teeth as the dentist from hell, Isaac Yankem DDS, I Yankem, get it? And then tried to scare us into turning over to WCW as fake Diesel, before finally just outright scaring us as Kane, the storyline brother of The Undertaker. The character was a winner from the off, making a grand debut by attacking the Phenom, ripping the door off the Hell in a Cell, and making the ring post shoot fire before unleashing a head-splitting tombstone piledriver. From there, Kane continued to show a mean streak and complete disregard for his kin, or anyone else for that matter, attempting to burn Taker alive by trapping him in a casket, and doing all manner of other horrible things. What made Kane so bloody disturbing was the fact that he didn't talk and couldn't emote, wearing a spooky mask in order to cover up an allegedly disfigured face. Patterned after slasher movie icons like Michael Myers and Freddy Krueger, the Big Red Machine was an unstoppable force who was seemingly impervious to pain and would stop at absolutely nothing to get what he wanted. And what he wanted was to inflict pain and suffering. Kane naturally evolved and developed layers, proving to be deft at comedy as well, but that early incarnation was not to be messed with. Number 1, The Undertaker. Whether he's a zombie funeral director, the leader of a cult, or a patriotic biker boy, The Undertaker is never not intimidating. WWE's greatest character creation has morphed seamlessly over 3 decades of in-ring competition, changing with the times and somehow managing to remain not just fresh, but firmly on top. When The Undertaker first entered WWE, however, fans didn't quite know what to make of him because there had never been anything like him before. Terrifying the kiddywinks with his size, look, lack of emotion, and obsession with death, the Phenom was something like you had, to that point, only read about in fairy tales or seen in your nightmares. Then there was the whole putting people in body bags and trying to bury them alive business. How am I supposed to rest in peace when you've put me in the ground while I'm still breathing, Mark? There's nothing peaceful about that, mate. Taker, like so many on this list, was able to pull off an outlandish persona because he lived it, traveling to and from arenas dressed from head to toe in black and not interacting with fans. He opened up a little more in time, but there was still enough mystique there for some true believers to question whether Big Evil liked to go grave robbing in his spare time.